My name is David Mitch, and I teach in the economics department here at UMBC. Let me mention, first of all, this event is affiliated with the UMBC Social Sciences Forum, and those of you wanting further social sciences events before the spring break begins, this coming Wednesday, the forum will be sponsoring the Joan Kornman Lecture on Negotiating Contaminated Identities, Gender, Water, and Development in Altered Waterscapes, and that'll be in the library gallery on the first floor of this building at 4 p.m. So today we will be considering, depending on your perspective, either the hard realities or the vagaries of the international monetary system. Our speaker is Barry Eichengreen. He is the George and Helen Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. It is relevant, I think, to note his interdisciplinary appointment, since his basic area of expertise is in the interdisciplinary field of economic history. In fact, he is currently serving as president of the Economic History Association, the major scholarly association for economic history in the United States. His work in economic history has spanned a wide range of geographical areas, time periods, and substantive topics, and indeed he has mentored many doctoral dissertations in a wide range of topics in economic history. However, he is best known for his work on the history of the international monetary system. His work in this field is distinguished by its ability to identify topics not only of historical significance, but of enduring policy significance and interest. His first major book, Golden Fetters, published in 1992, examined the contribution of national policy commitments to the gold standard in contributing to the severity of the global depression of the 1930s. And the book contributed, I think, to a better understanding of the role of international factors in the Great Depression. Another book of his that I've assigned in my own teaching is Globalizing Capital, A History of the International Monetary System. I have assigned this book because it makes students appreciate not only the role of standard economic mechanisms of adjustment, but also the role that political institutional factors have played in the workings of the international monetary arrangements. The book he will be talking about today has a subtitle, The Rise and Decline of the Dollar and the Future of the International Monetary System. In terms of ensuring significance, one possible exam question, I think, in a course on American economic history would be to ask students to comment on whether or not that subtitle, Rise and Decline of the Dollar, could be applied to any half century since American independence. And he may be talking about that. His work has been of great interest not only to economic historians, but also to those in the policy arena. He is chair of the Academic Advisory Committee of the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and he has been a senior policy advisor to the International Monetary Fund. And his itinerary for today has already included interviews with the Washington Bureau of the Wall Street Journal and a presentation of the World Bank. So it is a privilege, though dare I say not an exorbitant one, to turn the proceedings over to Professor Eichengreen.
So thank you to David Mitch. Thank you to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and to the Mullen lectureship as well for the invitation. It's especially gratifying to see such a large audience and this particular demographic. So it could be that you're here because of my renown, which David has just described. More likely, you're here because you're concerned about the future of the dollar. And maybe more likely than that, one of your professors said that the material from this afternoon may be on the midterm. At one level, this book tries to do what I've done in my previous publications, which is to use economic history to think not only about the past, but about our present and our prospective futures. At another level, this book is different from what I've written before, in that it really is an effort to speak to a broader audience. So when you try to do that and your publisher is trying to promote your book as a trade book, you do local radio. So I've had the pleasure, the mixed blessing of doing a lot of drive time morning radio programs talking about the dollar and talking about the economy. You learn, or I learned, that there is a considerable degree of anxiety out there about the future of the dollar. People worry about U.S. monetary policy and about the future of the currency. They worry about QE2, the Fed's second round of quantitative easing, and its implications for the dollar. They worry about the specter of triple-digit trillion-dollar budget deficits stretching as far into the future as the eye can see, and what they will imply. They worry about whether the Fed may eventually feel pressured to inflate away the federal debt. In venues like this, they ask me about the high price of gold and what it implies, whether it implies less than full confidence in the future of the dollar. So there are, it would appear, reasons to worry about the dollar. The good news, the bright side, if you will, is that there are reasons to worry about other currencies, like the euro, as well. And there is the fact that the dollar has the exorbitant privilege that it's not only our currency, but the world's. So that's what my book is about. And the phrase comes from French President Charles de Gaulle and his finance minister in the 1960s, who thought that it was unfair and potentially counterproductive for the world as a whole, that while the US was only one economy that then accounted for about 25% of global GDP, the dollar was nonetheless the world's currency. What's remarkable is the extent to which this is still true today. So the Bank for International Settlements, the central bankers bank, takes a survey of foreign exchange transactions every 3 years, and it released the most recent survey about a month ago, which showed that 85% of foreign exchange transactions worldwide involve dollars. 85% of all foreign exchange transactions are trades of other currencies for US dollars, despite the fact that the US accounts for less than 20% of the world economy and less than 20% of its trade. I spend some time in South Korea, which has a free trade agreement with Chile. And I've discovered that as a result of this, Chilean wine is the #1 selling wine in South Korea now. Montes Alpha is what they serve at conferences. But when a South Korean wholesaler or importer wants to purchase Chilean wine, the South Korean wholesaler sells Korean won for dollars and uses the dollars to pay the Chilean exporter. 99.4% of all foreign exchange transactions involving Korean won are trades of won for dollars. 99.6% of all foreign exchange transactions involving Chilean pesos are trades of pesos for dollars. So what is true of foreign exchange trading is true of other international business as well. The dollar is the single most important currency of denomination for international bonds issued by governments around the world. Fully 61% of all foreign exchange reserves of central banks and governments around the world are still held in dollars. So I provide some other examples in the book. When Somali pirates ransom a ship, they demand that the ransom money be parachuted to them in dollars. When Iran gives President Karzai's people bags full of money, the bags are full of dollars. I want to argue that while this may be a convenience for American firms and banks and tourists, that when we go abroad we can pay people in our own money and avoid the cost of changing money sometimes involve the risks associated with holding foreign currency. The fact that the dollar has the exorbitant privilege of being the world's currency can also create problems. Since foreigners need dollars in order to finance their international transactions, they want dollars to hold as insurance in the event of financial shocks. They're willing to lend to us in order to acquire those dollars. So if we in the United States are prone to financial excesses, if we engage in frenzied real estate speculation, foreign investors give us more rope. They willingly purchase U.S. Treasury securities or the securities of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. So if you want a one or two sentence summary of my view of the causes of the financial crisis that we've recently been through, it's the imbalance or the tension between what is an increasingly multipolar world, where the U.S. is only one of a set of consequential middle-sized economies, and what is, on the other hand, still a dollar-dominated, a peculiarly dollar-centric international monetary and financial world. So understanding where we might be going with what consequences, to me, implies first understanding where we've been and how we got into this situation. When did the dollar achieve its position of dominance? When did the dollar become the only true global currency? That actually occurred in steps, the first step being during and after World War I, but the second equally important step being during and after World War II. So a simple way of putting it would be, after World War II, the US was the only economy standing. We were the leading exporter. We, the United States, were the only country with deep and liquid financial markets open to the rest of the world. So it made perfect sense for importers and exporters and investors and bond underwriters all to do their international business using dollars. That's no longer the world in which we live. Since then, we've had the post-war recovery and growth of Europe. We've had the post-war recovery and growth of Japan. We've had the emergence of emerging markets, but there has been no commensurate decline in the relevant weight, in the relative weight of the dollar in international markets. The question being why, and the conventional answer being the advantages of incumbency. It's argued that incumbency is an advantage in holding on to international currency status, just like it's an advantage for an elected official in holding on to public office. For importers and exporters, quoting prices in dollars makes sense because your competitors quote their prices in dollars. It's a way of not confusing your customers and of signaling, if your prices are competitive, that they compare favorably to those of your customers. With everyone else quoting prices in dollars, it makes sense for you to continue to do so. So as many of you in the audience will know, economists have a name for situations like this. They call them markets characterized by network externalities, where it pays to do the same thing, to operate the same standard as everyone else in your network. And it's easily demonstrated that situations characterized by network externalities are also characterized by high levels of persistence. Once a practice, standardized practice, or a standard for short, is widely adopted, it tends to become locked in. Or so it is said. I now want to suggest that this presumption is no longer valid in our high-tech world. So once upon a time, it made sense for importers and exporters and investors and others to all want to use the same unit as other importers and exporters and investors and others in order to avoid confusing their customers. But that, once upon a time, is less and less the case of our world. Our world is one in which everybody carries in their pocket a device called a smartphone that can be used to compare currency values in real time. Our world is a world in which Currency Converter is one of the top 10 downloaded apps at the Apple iStore. So even if it was the case once upon a time that the advantages of doing the same thing as everybody else in international financial markets were very high, this is no longer the case. Once upon a time, it was said that there was only room for one operating standard for personal computers, that network externalities were very strong in markets for consumer electronics. Unless you were a dedicated computer hobbyist, you had to use Windows because everybody else used Windows. And if you were in business or in the university and you needed to exchange files with colleagues or classmates, you had to adopt the same standard. For computers, it was Windows. For finance, it was dollars. With computers, we've learned over time how to build open standards, and interchangeability costs have gone down. There is room for more than one operating standard. Microsoft has its, Apple has one, Google has one, Linux has one, and so forth and so on. They all share the market. I would suggest that what is true of computer operating systems will be true in the future of international finance. Once upon a time, there was room for only one true global currency, and that global currency was the dollar. But now, because switching and interchangeability costs have fallen, there is or will be room for several international currencies. We're heading, in other words, toward a world in which several currencies share the international stage. And I would argue, I'll come back to this, that this change, in my view, is not to be feared, it's to be welcomed. It will imply that we're moving toward a world in which there's a better balance or complementarity between the real economy, which is increasingly multipolar, and its monetary and financial system, which will similarly be increasingly multipolar. So which currencies specifically am I talking about? I would attach the highest probability to three: the dollar, the euro, and China's renminbi. So I pause to observe the smiles and the eyebrows going up. Different people in the audience are expressing involuntarily, perhaps, their reservations about this argument. They think that one of these currencies is not ready for prime time, and it's not going to be ready for prime time anytime soon. The problem being that different people in the audience have reservations about different ones of these three currencies. So let me take them briefly in order. I think it's fair to say that at the moment, pessimism is most pervasive about the euro. Europe is embroiled in a financial crisis. It's not clear that the countries at the center of that crisis, Greece and Ireland and Portugal, now being forced to impose truly draconian spending cuts, will be able to recover without reintroducing their own national currencies, so they can then turn around and depreciate those currencies and grow their exports. Keeping those countries in the euro area would require massive transfers to them from Germany, and German voters, it is said, would rather abandon the euro and reintroduce the Deutschmark than agree to this. So having said that, I believe that the euro will be one of the leading international currencies going forward. You can anticipate that I think all this euro doom and gloom is overdone. To be clear, the euro area falling apart is different from the possibility that a European government would have to restructure its debt, cosmetic financial language, from defaulting on its bonds. While a Greek or Irish debt default can't be ruled out, neither can a debt default by the city of Los Angeles or Nassau County, Long Island. But just like a default by Los Angeles or Nassau County wouldn't mean the end of the dollar, the city of Los Angeles would not introduce the Southern California peso as part of that debt restructuring. Neither would a Greek default mean the end of the euro. And I'm convinced, we can talk about it later if you want, that Greece would only make its economic and financial problems worse by, at the same time, reintroducing the drachma. Germany is the one country that could, in theory, leave the euro area and reintroduce its own currency without precipitating a financial crisis for itself. But Germany has too much invested in the European project, in the project of building the European Union, to turn its back on that now, which is what abandoning the single currency would mean. So we saw that again last weekend. There was another difficult summit Friday night and Saturday morning They went on until 1:30 in the morning before they could agree about what steps need to be taken to save the euro. And the Germans, German Chancellor Merkel, swallowed hard, courted the possibility of more electoral losses in the regional elections that are coming later this month, but said, yes, I recognize that in order to save the euro, we have to deepen the process of European integration, and that's my belief of what they will now do. So what Europe needs to do to prepare the euro for the global stage is to complete its monetary union. What Europe has is, what the monetary union has, is shiny coins and beautiful banknotes featuring mythical bridges and other European landmarks. They have a tolerably good central bank, but they don't have the other elements of a working economic and monetary union yet. I think the priority should be fixing Europe's banks and the way they're regulated. Europe, to have a single currency and a single financial market, but decentralized ad hoc bank regulation is, how should I put it politely, madness. So we have been through some problems in the United States recently because we have a overly decentralized system of bank regulation, and we made an effort under Frank Dodd and other financial reforms to deal with that, not too successfully, but we tried. The euro area has one currency and 17 bank regulators, none of whom pay attention to the implications of inadequate regulation of their banks for the neighbors. So they're going to have to fix that. They will have to create a permanent European monetary fund, an emergency lending fund to do the equivalent of what the International Monetary Fund does for developing countries. And they will ultimately have to allow the Greeks and perhaps others to restructure their crushing public debts. I think they will do that. Jean Monnet, the father of European integration, said Europe is forged in crises. It takes, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. It requires a full-blown crisis before European leaders, I'm mixing my metaphors, with their backs to the wall, are prepared to go forward. I think that's what they will do now. So much for the euro. Let me talk for a couple of minutes about the dollar, and then a couple of minutes about China's currency. People living in this zip code will be familiar about the economic and financial problems facing the United States. In a sentence, they are dysfunctional politics that continue to undermine efforts to bring America's chronic budget deficits under control, the problems of divided government, making that all the more difficult. Federal debt as a share of U.S. GDP will rise to 75%, as I do the accounting. Different people do it differently, relatively soon. And servicing a public debt that is 75% of national income is really hard for a federal government that in good times only raises 19% of GDP in taxes. So when interest rates return to normal levels, as they presumably will in this country, someday a fifth of all tax revenues will go to servicing that public debt, even if we prevent it from rising further. And as you know, the fiscal situation only darkens after that with explosive growth of healthcare costs in particular. So in my book, I talk about two scenarios, and one in which we fail to address these problems. And there comes a point where foreign investors, the People's Bank of China, do what Bill Gross did, the manager of PIMCO, the biggest of the bond funds, last week, and get out of U.S. Treasury bonds entirely. So there is a scenario of where the dollar crashes, where interest rates spike, where important investors get wrong-footed, where a whole range of bad economic and financial things happen. And I have some estimates in the book of how costly that would be to the United States. There's a more benign scenario in which just like the Europeans, when they have their backs to the wall, they do the right thing. The US Congress, the US government more generally, does the right thing as well. For example, there was a hopeful story in the Wall Street Journal today about the so-called Gang of Six, the 3 Republican and 3 Democratic senators who are trying to build a coalition for fiscal reform that would involve tax cuts and, I guess what is euphemistically called around here, revenue enhancement, which would address the budgetary problem by recognizing that multiple things have to be done to bring it under control. So in that more benign scenario, I would see a gradual movement away from dollar dominance. The dollar would continue to occupy the international stage, but it would have rivals, and the benefits of its exorbitant privilege that it's used so broadly internationally would be retained, but they would have to be increasingly shared. Finally, China's currency. China will have to surmount very significant challenges in order to make its currency attractive for widespread international use. They will have to encourage banks and firms not only in China itself but around the world to use China's currency for financing and settling international trade. They will have to build deep and liquid financial markets and make them accessible to foreigners. They will have to move many of the financial restrictions that are integral to their development model. They will have to establish rule of law, things that are clearly not done overnight. Not done overnight is consistent with the view that they can be done in as short a period as, say, 10 years. So that would be my expectation, that the Chinese will have succeeded in significantly internationalizing their currency and that it will have become widely used internationally along with the dollar and the euro by 2020. And I believe this is possible for 2 reasons. Number one, Chinese officials have made it a target. They've said they want to turn Shanghai into a true first-class international financial center by 2020, which would require many of the changes that I described before. They are now moving very quickly. So they've moved from a situation where essentially no companies were using Chinese renminbi for their cross-border trade settlements a year ago, where to one now where something, the numbers are changing rapidly. I think something approaching 70,000 companies, mainly Chinese, are using China's currency for cross-border settlements. They're experimenting in Hong Kong in allowing foreign companies to issue bonds denominated in China's own currency. And there's something on the order of 50 so-called dim sum bonds that have been issued in Hong Kong in the last year by companies like McDonald's and Caterpillar and others. Hong Kong is China's petri dish. They figure out what works there, and when they find out what works, they transfer the culture, if you will, to Beijing and Shanghai. So they are moving very quickly to internationalize their currency. And they're doing that because they see that as having significant advantages for their economy, for their own banks and their own firms. So they see it as an advantage if China's companies can do their own business in China's own money. Saves them the same costs, shelters them from the same risks that US companies save and are sheltered from when they do business in dollars. They want their own banks, China's banks, to be able to get a bigger slice of the international financial pie by allowing them to do more business in China's own currency. So as of January, you were able to open you and I were able to open a bank account, an FDIC insured bank account in Chinese renminbi at the New York branch of the Bank of China, not the central bank, the People's Bank of China, but a Chinese commercial bank, the Bank of China. You can do it on the internet up to a ceiling of $4,000, although that ceiling will presumably go up over time. So they're doing a variety of things to internationalize their currency because they see doing so as in their self-interest. That's reason number one. I think it will be done in as short a period as 10 years. Reason number two is that history tells us that it is possible to move from a position where a currency is not used internationally to a position where it is very extensively used for international transactions by foreigners as well as residents in a period as short as of 10 years. In particular, American economic history tells us this is possible. So in 1914, the dollar was not used for international transactions. Imports and exports, 0% of global imports and exports were financed and invoiced in dollars. When American exporters or importers wanted trade credit, they had to go to London to get it from a British bank, and it was denominated in pound sterling. In 1914, 0.0% of international bonds were in US dollars. In 1914, 0.0% of the foreign exchange reserves of central banks around the world were in dollars. All that changed rather dramatically. Already in 1924, the dollar had overtaken sterling. The pound sterling is the leading international currency. So recall I told you before the dollar rose to dominance in two stages, one during and after World War I, the second time during and after. Second step was during and after World War II. What did we do starting in 1914? We established a central bank to provide liquidity to these international markets. It was called the Federal Reserve System. And one of the motivations for establishing it was to hasten the internationalization of the dollar. People like Benjamin Strong, who was J.P. Morgan's right-hand man and had managed the 1907 financial crisis, saw the fact that U.S. banks and exporters had to do business in other people's money as a competitive disadvantage and worked to change that, along with people like Frank Vanderlip, who was the president of National City Bank, what quickly became the most important international bank, and Nelson Aldrich, the U.S. senator from Rockefeller, actually the U.S. senator from Rhode Island, although he was called both. They worked together to establish the Fed, partly in order to internationalize the dollar. The Federal Reserve Bank allowed U.S. banks to branch abroad and originate foreign business for the first time. So my message is, if policymakers are intent on making this happen, and if they put the relevant supports, the relevant institutional infrastructure in place, this kind of transition is possible. It can be completed relatively quickly. So I will acknowledge that there were other things that happened between 1914 and 1924, that World War I hastened this transition as well. But I would argue that the point stands. So for all these reasons, my baseline scenario, if you will, is one in which the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi all play consequential international roles 10 years from now, that we will have a global monetary and financial system no longer disproportionately organized around the dollar, but instead organized around multiple international currencies. So the last question I want to ask, and then I'll be happy to take questions, is whether we should worry. As I said before, my view is that the world will probably be a safer financial place when there is a better balance between the real economy and its monetary and financial system. That if one of the reserve issuing countries, say the United States, again becomes prone to financial excesses, and we have another real estate bubble, or we have another bubble in some other financial market, we in the U.S. will feel the discipline of the markets more quickly and more regularly. Foreigners will not lend to us so freely and mindlessly as they have in the past, because when they need international liquidity, they have nowhere to get it but from the United States in the form of dollars. Other people warn that a multiple international currency system could be dangerously unstable, with dollars and euros and eventually renminbi all trading in liquid markets and all being substitutes for one another. Their exchange rates could become dangerously volatile. Even a limited loss of confidence would cause investors, including official investors, now to rush out of one of the reserve currencies, aggravating financial difficulties in the problem country, and indeed aggravating financial difficulties in the other reserve issuing countries, which would see their currencies go through the roof. I think that view is in fact based on a mischaracterization of what central banks do. The big new holders of diversified currency portfolios will be central bank reserve managers. So in the course of thinking about this project, I went off and talked to quite a number of them. And I can report to you that central bank reserve managers are different from hedge fund managers. They don't dress as well because they're not compensated in the same fashion. They're not compensated on a 2 and 20 basis. They don't get 20% of the profits from their trades. They have social responsibilities, and they know it. Their principals, the central bank boards and citizenry for whom they, on whose behalf they work, have longer horizons. They're more patient than the typical hedge fund investors. All of this means that private investors find it hard to act as contrarians, even if they think that a currency has been beaten down, its exchange rate has depreciated excessively. It can be expensive and very risky for a hedge fund to take a contrary position and buy that currency. They have to show some profits from doing that. They have to expect the exchange rate to come back quickly before that's a bet they can take. Central bank reserve managers, as I said, have longer horizons. They have guaranteed funding. They're in a better position to act as what economists refer to as stabilizing speculators. So there actually is a little bit of empirical work on this. How do central bank reserve managers react when exchange rates move, when currencies go haywire? The best work I know actually is done by Ted Truman, who's at the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. And it is consistent with this idea that central bank reserve managers act as stabilizing speculators, that they do act as contrarians. So if you want a concrete example of this, central banks bought more than $100 billion worth of dollar bonds in the third quarter of 2010, a quarter when the dollar was weakening. They were going in and scooping up the cheap assets in order to rebalance their portfolios and stabilizing the markets. So the final question I would ask is, what else can be done in terms of policy to stabilize a multiple international currency system? It's trite but true. It's important enough to emphasize the obvious: sound and stable policies on the part of the reserve issuing countries themselves. So U.S. economic policy, the policies of the euro area, and sound and stable policies in China, none of which are guaranteed, are the most important things we need for a stable multiple international currency system. I think we need more IMF reform. The IMF is the institution that oversees, monitors the operation of this system and sounds the alarm bells in principle, if something goes wrong. It has no leverage over big countries that never borrow from it and issue debt in their own currency. It has no leverage over countries like China that feel underrepresented at the fund and therefore doubt or question its legitimacy. So making IMF surveillance more symmetrical, having it apply equally to big countries and small countries, to surplus countries and deficit countries, and enhancing the legitimacy of the institution would be important as well. I think what would not help is trying to stabilize the exchange rates between the three major international currencies. This has been suggested from time to time. So the French took over the presidency of the group of 20 countries, the de facto steering committee for the world economy, in January. In anticipation of that, French President Sarkozy made a widely reported speech last August to France's foreign ambassadors saying, now that we're chairing the group of 20, we need to do something important. Let's have a new Bretton Woods agreement and stabilize the exchange rates between the dollar, the euro, and the renminbi. It was pointed out to him subsequently by a variety of people that economic conditions will continue to differ between the US and Europe and China. Appropriate monetary policies will continue to differ between the US, Europe, and China. So it would be foolhardy to try to stabilize the exchange rates between their respective currencies. Such an agreement would quickly come undone, presumably with disastrous consequences. So let me conclude. I'm in the somewhat anomalous position for an economist who's supposed to be a messenger of doom and gloom, a dismal scientist, to be able to end on a positive note. I think international monetary and financial system organized around multiple international currencies is coming, and I think that is a good thing. That's a change to be welcomed, not feared. Our financial system will be more stable when there is a better match between what is an increasingly multipolar real economy, but still today a heavily dollar-dominated international monetary and financial news. So that's the international monetary and financial world. So that's the good news, that we can get to that better balance in as few as, say, 10 years. The bad news is that history tells us that financial crises occur with some regularity on a cycle of approximately every 3 years. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
I would like to take an entirely different view of the whole thing. You're saying these currency controls help large multi-billion international corporations buy and sell at relatively stabilized prices. Every one of these corporations has a place on its profit and loss statement, which is called bad debts. And it accounts for the fact that some of the money they're going to take in will not be paid, and there will be currency losses. And they will have to eat those losses as part of their losses. What does that mean to me? I can live with their suffering and losing money here and there on this trade or that trade. It doesn't bother me. In a world when corporations were much smaller and these large multi-billion corporations didn't exist, we managed the world pretty much as
So I'm gonna ask you to please pose a question, if you'd be so kind.
Well, my argument is that we don't have to run the world for the convenience of these multi-billion-dollar corporations. And a lot more flexibility in currencies is perfectly okay with me.
And if you listen to my talk, it is indeed perfectly okay with me. As I said, I think an attempt to peg exchange rates in a world of globalization, where, like it or not, people are mobile, capital is mobile, information is mobile, would quickly come undone. So I don't think currency flexibility is a bad thing either.
With your statement saying that you have a very positive outlook on the idea of having multiple currencies running the global economy, and what my worry is painting the scenario we are right now, where we have a lot of debt that is owned by China, and right now with the way our with the things such as healthcare reform, if it was to be reversed to become constitutional, that could cause a huge, restriction on the way our economy grows. So this debt is obviously going to be here for a long time. Now, if China was to become an international player with their currency, I would assume that they would be most likely to replace our debt, which is dollars, with their currency. And once our debt is in their currency, if we were to experience a lot of inflation, if they were to stabilize their currency, they're actually controlling how much we owe them. Now, how would we react to, and how would we deal with them having our debt in their currency?
So, toward the end of my book, I think about a lot of possible scenarios under which the dollar could lose its international currency status. Could there be some kind of geopolitical conflict between the U.S. and China, in response to which they might use their financial weapon in the same way that the U.S., by only threatening to sell pound sterling, was able to get the British Army to withdraw from Suez? There's that part of the world again in 1956. I think the current situation is different in that China's holdings of U.S. treasuries are so important to China that they would be shooting themselves in the foot if they moved very quickly to try to sell them. So I spin out various possible scenarios of a dollar crash, and I conclude I think the language is the only plausible dollar scenario for a dollar crash is where we do it to ourselves. But where we do it to ourselves to such an extent that people don't want assets denominated in U.S. dollars anymore, so the U.S. has to borrow in foreign currencies, that would make life very difficult for the United States. It would require fundamental changes in how the Fed thinks about monetary policy, for example. We went a step down that road in the 1960s when we issued so-called RUSA bonds after Robert RUSA that were foreign currency indexed. I think there were Carter bonds toward the end of the Carter administration as well. Many people, when they think about that, and on balance I include myself, think it is a bit far-fetched still to think that financial problems in the U.S. could become so extreme. The crisis of confidence in the U.S. government could become so pronounced that in order to finance its operations, it would have to borrow in foreign currencies. But, it is conceivable, one can imagine a scenario where it comes to that.
I'm not too completely reassured by your view that when we have three international currencies that central bankers are going to be able to be a force of stability, what's the possibility of major political leaders trying to override their judgment? In your book, you cited Nixon's successful leading on Arthur Burns to act against his own personal judgment.
Well, I think central bank independence is always, what is the right word here, delicate or valuable but imperfect. And this is true in our current monetary system, where the Fed's independence is challenged from time to time on Capitol Hill, where the question of whether the Fed should have the right to engage in the unprecedented kind of monetary operations that it's undertaken in the last years should be allowed to continue or not. So all I'm saying is that monetary policy is made in a political world, and that's equally true of the world in which we currently live, as it will be 10 years from now.
I've noticed over the last decade several trends dealing with a different type of currency that you didn't mention, which is gold and silver. I've noticed the Indian central bank was quick to buy up central bank or IMF offerings of gold and silver. I've noticed individuals across the world are turning to gold and silver as a store of value since fiat currency is failing that purpose. I've noticed different state legislators considering allowing gold and silver to compete with fiat currencies. And thinking of how fiat currencies are only 40 years old, why didn't you include the possibility of gold and silver when there's evidence that people are turning to that regardless?
Right, so the question is about gold and more generally about commodity money. And there are different ways to think about that. So one is, should an investor's well-diversified portfolio have investments in commodities as well as in financial assets? So none of this is investment advice. Don't try this at home. Don't believe anything an academic tells you about investing. But portfolio theory says that diversification is good, and that presumably should extend to investments in commodities or in things whose returns vary with commodity prices. I think that's a different story from the idea that the U.S. money supply and therefore U.S. interest rates should be mechanically tethered to the price of gold, basically, or the stock of monetary gold held by the U.S. government or one of its agencies, as was the case before 1913, as was the case to an extent before 1933, as was the case to an even more limited extent before 1971. The price of gold is very volatile, and the U.S. money supply would therefore become very volatile as well, in my view, if we were so bold or reckless as to attempt to tie the Fed's hands in that way. John Maynard Keynes, the famous English economist, had a phrase about this in 1925, about gold being a barbarous relic. I think it has become an even more barbarous monetary relic over time. You cited the example of the Reserve Bank of India, which bought some gold in 2008, and there were a few other central banks, the Russian Central Bank and Bangladesh and a few others, which have bought some gold. But central banks have been moving steadily in the other direction, almost without interruption, for the better part of 100 years. So I think there are both historical arguments and analytical arguments why it's, in my opinion, better to trust Mr. Bernanke and his colleagues with our monetary future than it is the foibles of the gold market.
So I noticed in the middle of your talk you mentioned that it was madness to have a monetary union fragmented in banking supervisors. And I wondered if you also thought, and I'm surprised that you didn't go this way, that it was madness to have a monetary union fragmented instead of fiscal decisions.
Yeah, so the question is about whether a monetary union needs a fiscal union or a fiscal federation like we have in the United States. I do think a lot of the teething difficulties with the euro reflect the fact that they have monetary union, but they don't have a unified fisc. They don't have unified bank regulation. But the question is, if you're not going to get a European federation or state, and there's limited appetite within Europe for transferring national powers to Brussels, what is the most value? Where do you get the most bang for the buck or the most bang for the euro? By transferring some regulatory function up to the level of the European Union. So at the moment they're talking about what to do about bank regulation, and they've established something called the European Banking Authority, the EBA, which started operating on January 1st, but doesn't yet have much of a staff or a whole lot of statutory powers. I think they're going to move in that direction. They're talking at the moment about the need for more tax harmonization as a first step in the direction of greater fiscal centralization or coordination. The Irish are all hot and bothered about that because they derive benefits from their unusually low corporate tax rate. But I think Europe will move that in that direction as well. But my answer to you basically would be there's a limited appetite in Europe for more centralization. what do I think the most valuable thing to move up to the EU level would be? And the answer is bank regulation rather than fiscal centralization. There's one behind you.
Can you give us a sense of scale of this privilege? In other words, does it help us roughly 0.5 percent point on interest, 10 cents on import price side? What's the magnitude of this privilege?
Well, if you add it all up, I come up with numbers like 3% of GDP. That we can run larger current account deficits. We can spend more than we produce as a result of the fact that foreigners want our dollars and they give us real stuff in order to acquire them. So they have to produce BMWs or flat screen TVs, and we just give them pieces of paper that we pay a tiny bit of interest on. Our living standards are higher than they would be otherwise. The dollar is stronger and the purchasing power of our incomes are higher than they would be otherwise. So if I add all that up, the value of the dollar's exorbitant privilege is about 1 year's worth of economic growth. And we were reminded in the Great Recession how different life feels when the economy is growing and when it's not. So that 3% is the difference between our living standards now, by my estimates, and what they would be if the dollar's exorbitant privilege was lost entirely. If it was only shared with other currencies, then you would want to take some fraction of that and say 10 years from now, US living standards will be 1.5% lower than they would have been in this counterfactual world where you didn't have a shift toward multiple international currencies. And as I said, I think there will be some compensating benefits in terms of greater economic and financial stability as opposed to simply living standards at a point in time. You want to come back?
Yes, I'd like to follow up on this question that was raised about the viability of the European Monetary Union. I really can't see that Greece's position is tenable. Unable to adjust their exchange rate, they're going to have to deflate the economy to an extent that's, I think, is politically impossible. And the larger country, Germany, doesn't seem to have the political appetite to sustain them. I wonder. I feel in the small country, the whole idea was a mistake to have these small countries in the union with France and Germany.
So the question is about the euro and about what countries like Greece can and will do. So the mistake part, I agree with you, but I would observe that hindsight is 20/20, and that the problems created by establishing such a heterogeneous monetary union that included small and I'm trying to find out a euphemism for corruption-ridden, and I can't think of one. But small countries with poor European countries with transparency problems, and other countries like Germany, all in the same monetary union, created some very serious difficulties. But in life and in economic history, some processes are irreversible. Some economic models don't work the same way when you solve them forward and backwards. The euro is a fact on the ground, and getting out of it will be, never say never, but getting out of it will be as near as anything that I can think of economically impossible. They're going to have to figure out how to make it work. The diagnosis, the prescription for Greece is, since you can't do an external devaluation, you don't have your own currency to depreciate, you have to do an internal devaluation, which means University of Maryland style cuts in wages and salaries, also University of California style. They have to do big internal cuts. And it's simply not a political equilibrium to cut everybody's wages and salaries and pensions without requiring the bondholders to feel some pain as well. You can't do an internal devaluation where you lower the prices of everything by 20%, except for the prices of the bonds. which still have to be serviced at those old 20% higher prices. So that's why Greece will have to do a debt restructuring where they reduce the value of those bonds by telling the bondholders, we can't pay when everybody else is feeling pain and taking cuts. You have to feel some pain too. And we know how to do that kind of debt restructuring. We did one like that in Latin America at the end of the 1980s. It was called the Brady Plan. Call up Mr. Brady, dust off the plans. They can be implemented in Europe. So I think that's what's going to happen. They're going to do a debt restructuring. They have had a very big party for the last 10 years. So they'll have a big hangover for, I don't know, for the next 10, but for a while. Now, it's like our financial crisis in 2007, 2009. You dig such a deep hole for yourself, there is no painless way of climbing out. So there will be pain. But if they do the debt restructuring they need and the other reforms that are in train now, they will grow. So eventually. So the other part of the my answer has to do with why not reintroduce the drachma? And the simple answer would be because Greece is part of the European Union and it's the oldest democracy in the world. It has signed a variety of binding treaties with its European Union partners. It will have to discuss with them how to reintroduce the drachma. Greece is a democracy, so the parliament will have to debate the desirability of leaving the euro area. Actually, the only way you can leave the euro area under the Treaty of Lisbon is by leaving the EU entirely. The treaties don't say anything about leaving the euro, abandoning the euro, but there is a provision that if your EU partners agree, you can leave the EU, the implicit assumption being you would also be leaving the euro under those circumstances. So let's say word gets out, as it always does, that there are discussions in Brussels about this possibility. And word gets out that there are discussions in the halls of the Greek parliament about this possibility. You're a citizen of Greece and you have a bank account, and you hear that they're contemplating the possibility, no matter how slight, that they might be reintroducing the drachma with the purpose of depreciating it and enhancing the competitiveness of Greek exports. What do you do with your bank account on the first minute that you hear that? You transfer all your money to Frankfurt, where it's, in good, safe and sound euros. Let's say you hold a Greek bond. What do you do with your Greek bond the first minute you hear that? You sell it and you buy German bonds. This would be the mother of all financial crises. This would be the worst financial crisis ever seen on the history, on the face of the earth. And there's no way around it. So I see hands going up and people say, well, what about other examples of the breakup of currency unions? They didn't happen in democracies. They happened in settings where there were border guards and restrictions on capital mobility. They happened in Eastern Europe where they hadn't grown banking systems yet. I don't think it can be done, and everything that Greek politicians and others have done so far suggests that they don't think it can be done either. So I should acknowledge that way back in 2007, before anybody took any of this stuff seriously, a couple of economics colleagues, Alberto Alesina and Francesco Giavazzi, organized a conference, and they came to me and said, would you write a paper on the breakup of the euro area? And in a moment of weakness, I agreed. And I wrote the paper I just described to you. It can't happen. So I have a horse in this game. I have something at stake here. Paul Krugman has taken out after me on this one on his blog, saying, my argument is that one would have to close down the entire Greek banking system and all its financial markets and close down its borders for a couple of weeks in order to reintroduce the drachma, and that would be incredibly costly. And Paul's response to me was, well, Greece may soon be in such a crisis it's going to have to do that anyway, and when it finds itself having been forced to close down its banking system, it can take advantage of that fact to reintroduce the drachma. my response to Paul was, European leaders understand this game too, and they have just thrown going on 100 billion euros at Greece to prevent that from happening, and they will do more of the same if push comes to shove.
Just a really brief comment. I mean, what makes you think that depositors will haven't already, Greek depositors haven't already moved to Frankfurt or Cyprus or UK in the crisis ahead?
Well, what convinces me that they haven't already done it is the careful numbers constructed by the Bank for International Settlements released this morning that show that there have been some drains from the Greek and Irish banking systems. But, you know, most of the money is still there. I think maybe I should say thank you very much.
But I should also add that we have a number of privileges here. First of all, there's food and beverage back there, and there's also the opportunity to have our speaker autograph his book.
Which
So
he's
you can
happy to do.
He's happy to do, even personalize it.
Indeed. Thank you very much.